The wind off the High Line in November doesn't blow so much as it cuts. It finds gaps you didn't know existed, between logs, under doors, through the knotholes of green timber, and by the time it reaches a stove, the heat is already gone. Every man who'd spent a winter in Northeastern Montana understood this. Every man knew what a proper shelter looked like. Square walls, a steep pitched roof to shed snow, a stone chimney set in the center, a woodpile stacked twice as high as a grown man's shoulder. That was a formula. That was what kept you alive. So when a curved metal structure began rising from a frozen homestead lot 6 miles south of Havre in the fall of 1952, the county noticed. It wasn't a barn. It wasn't a grain silo. It was a Quonset hut, one of the half-cylindrical corrugated steel shells the U.S. Army had used by the thousands during the war, now decommissioned and scattered across the country for surplus sale. And someone was trying to live in it through a Montana winter. The most experienced contractor in Blaine County looked at it once and didn't mince words. "That man," he told the hardware store owner in Havre, "is going to freeze inside a tin can." The phrase stuck. By December, the structure was known up and down the road as the Tin Can. The man building it was known as the fool living inside one. His name was Vernon Holt, and he had already solved every problem they thought he hadn't considered. Today, you're going to understand exactly what Vernon knew, and why the shape everyone laughed had turned out to be the most thermally efficient shelter within 40 miles of the Milk River. If you've ever questioned whether unconventional thinking has a place in survival engineering, stay with this video until the end. The numbers will answer that for you. And before we go further, if this kind of forgotten frontier knowledge is what you're here for, hit subscribe right now. Every week, we go deep into the techniques that kept people alive when the margin between warm and frozen was measured in inches of stone and hours of retained heat. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We want to know what kind of winters you're dealing with. Vernon Holt had come back from Korea in 1951 with two things: a partial hearing loss in his left ear from artillery, and a very specific way of thinking about problems. Not the civilian way, which, in his estimation, tended to ask, what does this look like? But the Army way, which asked, what does this do? He'd grown up in Blaine County. He knew the winters. He'd spent 2 of them before the war in a standard-framed homestead cabin on his uncle's land, a cabin built exactly the way everyone built them, square and solid, with a central iron stove and a log wall chinked with a mixture of clay and horsehair. It worked. It also consumed, by Vernon's own careful count, between 4 and 5 cords of firewood per winter. That was roughly 200 to 250 cubic feet of split, seasoned hardwood, fed into the stove around the clock from November through March. The problem wasn't the stove. The problem was the geometry. A square cabin loses heat from every flat surface simultaneously. The 4 walls, the floor, the ceiling, each one radiates warmth outward into the cold while the wind presses against them from outside. The corners are particularly brutal. They create converging cold zones where 2 exterior surfaces meet, and no amount of chinking fully seals the thermal bridge that forms there. Local oral accounts from that era consistently describe the same phenomenon. A cabin that felt warm at chest height, but would freeze a wet boot left on the floor by morning. Vernon had looked at his Quonset shell, 16 feet wide, 36 feet long, 8 feet at the peak, and seen something different. He hadn't bought it as a novelty. He'd bought it because a surplus Army depot outside of Great Falls was selling them for $140 each, and because he understood from 2 years of sleeping in military field shelters that the curve was not a weakness. It was the reason the structure didn't collapse under a meter of snow. It was the reason the wind couldn't find a flat face to press against. But a curved metal shell by itself was not a home. Metal conducts heat the way water conducts electricity, instantly and without mercy. An unmodified Quonset hut in a Montana winter would be colder inside than out within hours of the fire dying. Vernon knew this. That was precisely why what he was building looked so strange to everyone watching. What Vernon was constructing was not simply a Quonset hut. It was a layered thermal system, and each layer had a specific job that the people watching from the road didn't understand, because none of it looked like anything they'd seen before. The first layer was a berm. Starting in late October, Vernon used a rented farm tractor with a blade, to push compacted earth up against the lower third of the curved exterior, approximately 3 feet of packed clay soil on each side, rising to about 4.5 feet at the base of the curve. The effect was to bury the lower portion of the metal shell entirely. From a distance, the hut appeared to grow directly from the ground like a buried barrel. From an engineering standpoint, what Vernon had done was eliminate the most vulnerable section of the structure's thermal envelope. The ground at 18 inches of depth in Montana holds a relatively stable temperature of around 40 degrees Fahrenheit to 45 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 degrees Celsius to 7 degrees Celsius, year-round, far warmer than the minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 29 degrees Celsius air of a January night. By pressing that earth mass against the steel, he replaced a direct air-to-metal heat loss with a ground-to-earth buffer. The second layer was the interior stone wall. Along the north-facing interior wall, Vernon dry-stacked approximately 2,400 pounds of flat limestone he'd pulled from a nearby coulee, a wall roughly 8 feet long, 5 feet high, and 14 inches thick. This was not decorative. Limestone, like sandstone and granite, has the property of absorbing heat slowly and releasing it slowly, a principle called thermal mass. Think of it as a battery for warmth. You charge it during the hours the stove is burning hot, and it discharges that heat gradually through the night, long after the fire has dropped the coals. A well-charged limestone wall of that dimension can release usable radiant heat for 6 to 10 hours after the firebox goes cold. The third layer was the floor. Vernon dug the interior of the hut 18 inches below the original grade before laying a compacted gravel bed and a rough plank floor over it. Dropping the living level below ground reduced the effective ceiling height, exposed the wind-driven cold on the exterior, and, critically, brought the floor surface closer to the stable thermal layer of the earth beneath it. Cold air, being denser than warm air, falls. By lowering the floor, Vernon ensured that the coldest zone of the interior air column was partially offset by ground warmth rising from below. Taken together, these three elements, earthen berm, limestone thermal wall, sunken floor, formed a system that stored heat, slowed its escape, and replaced lost warmth from below. Vernon had not invented any individual technique. The berm concept was used in sod houses across the Great Plains since the 1860s. Thermal mass walls appeared in Pueblo adobe construction centuries before European settlement. The sunken floor was a feature of the semi-subterranean pit houses built by Plains peoples long before the homestead era. What Vernon had done was combine them inside a modern surplus shell, and that combination was what no one in Blaine County could make sense of. They saw the dirt piled against a metal building and thought, moisture, rot, structural failure. Vernon had thought about all of that. He'd graded the berm with a slight outward slope to drain precipitation away from shell. He'd applied a coal tar pitch coating to the exterior steel before pushing the earth against it. He'd left a 6-inch ventilation gap along the roof peak on both ends to prevent condensation buildup inside. None of those details were visible from the road. All anyone saw was a tin can half buried in dirt. In small rural counties, reputation travels faster than weather reports. And in Blaine County in the fall of 1952, the reputation of Vernon Holt's project had already been decided by three men whose opinions the community trusted without much question. The first was Rupert Gandy, the senior building contractor in Havre, who had framed and finished more structures in that county than anyone alive at the time. Gandy had driven past the site twice and made his assessment without stopping. Steel sweats, he told anyone who asked. You pack dirt against steel, you trap moisture. By March, that shell is going to be rusting from the outside and dripping from the inside. It'll be uninhabitable before spring. He said it with the flat certainty of a man who had never been wrong about a building in 30 years. People believed him. The second was a county agriculture extension agent, a careful, methodical man named Dale Pruitt, who had spent his career advising farmers on structures, soil management, and winterization. Pruitt didn't make public speeches. He filed a written note, part of a routine survey of new dwellings in the county, that described the structure as a substandard cold-weather dwelling with inadequate insulation characteristics and unverified ventilation. The note wasn't inflammatory. It was bureaucratic, which somehow made it more damning. The third voice was the one Vernon felt most directly. Art Shell ran the hardware and stove supply in Havre, and he sold and installed heating units to virtually every homestead and farmhouse within 30 miles. When Vernon came in asking about a suitable wood-burning stove for a 576-square-foot steel structure with a stone interior wall, Shell looked at him for a long moment and said, "I won't sell you a stove for that. There's no stove made that heats a metal box efficiently. You'll burn through a quart a week and still wake up cold." Then he turned back to his inventory. Vernon bought his stove from a supplier in Great Falls. The community took its cues from Gandy, Pruitt, and Shell. The mockery wasn't vicious. It was a low, continuous kind that rural communities reserve for the man who does something obviously pointless. Neighbors slowed their trucks when they passed. A few stopped to ask questions, but the tone wasn't curiosity. It was the social performance of concern for someone who had clearly made a mistake. One man offered to buy the Quonset shell from Vernon at scrap price before winter made it impossible to dismantle. Vernon declined. He stacked his firewood, a precise 2.3 cords, split and covered, and waited. The winter that arrived in Northeastern Montana in January of 1953 was not unusual by the standards of the High Line. It was just unrelenting in a way that exposed every weakness in every structure that had cut corners, used green timber, or relied on a stove to compensate for poor design. The cold snap began on January 11th and held for 19 consecutive days. Temperatures dropped to minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 30 degrees Celsius on the coldest nights, with wind chills pushing the felt temperature well below minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 40 degrees Celsius at times. The wind was a defining feature, a sustained northwest wind that didn't gust and die but pressed continuously against every wall in the county for days at a stretch. Firewood consumption across the region spiked. 2 families within a mile of Vernon's property ran short and began burning fence posts. A third reported burst pipes in their entry room, where the wall framing had never been fully sealed against the wind. The county road was passable but slow. People stayed close to their stoves, and the stoves in standard frame cabins with flat walls and exposed corners worked almost continuously to maintain temperatures that most of those families would have described as livable, meaning somewhere between 48 degrees Fahrenheit and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, 9 degrees Celsius and 13 degrees Celsius, during the day, with the fire burning steadily, and dropping through the night when the fire was banked low to last until morning. Inside Vernon Holt's buried tin can, the situation was different, but nobody knew that yet. He was keeping a handwritten log. Temperatures taken at 3 points in the interior, floor level, chest height, and near the ceiling peak, at intervals of roughly 4 hours. He recorded fuel consumption daily. He noted the exterior conditions as best he could estimate them. The log survived in the possession of a family member and was shared, decades later, with a local historical society that included excerpts in a 1987 county archive publication. Stay with me, because what those numbers show when the storm finally broke is a detail that ended every argument in that county. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Every week we bring you stories like this one, real engineering decisions made by real people when the margin for error was zero. The knowledge in these stories took generations to develop, and almost no time to forget. We're putting it back on the record. When the cold snap broke on January 30th, a neighbor named Calvin Marsh rode over to check on Vernon. Marsh had been among the more vocal skeptics, not mean-spirited, but consistent. He'd told Vernon in October that the earth against the steel was going to cause problems. He'd repeated it in November. He'd thought about it again during the worst nights of January, when his own cabin had dropped to 39 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 degrees Celsius. By 4 a.m., despite a fire he kept burning through the night, what he found when he stepped through the door of the Quonset hut stopped him mid-sentence. The interior was 61 degrees Fahrenheit, 16 degrees Celsius. The stove had been out since the previous evening, roughly 11 hours. The limestone wall along the north side was warm to the touch. The floor, 18 inches below grade, held at 52 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 degrees Celsius even without active heating. Vernon was sitting at a small table drinking coffee, wearing a flannel shirt. Marsh asked how much would he'd burned. Vernon showed him the log. Over the 19-day cold snap, Vernon had consumed 0.9 cords of firewood, approximately 45 cubic feet of split wood. His nearest neighbor, in a standard frame log cabin of comparable floor area, had burned through 2.1 cords in the same period and had still recorded interior lows of 34 degrees Fahrenheit, 1 degree Celsius on the 3 coldest nights. 2 other neighbors within half a mile had used between 1.7 and 1.9 cords each, with similar interior temperature drops. The thermal performance breakdown, reconstructed from Vernon's log and later corroborated by informal accounts in the community, showed the following pattern. The earthen berm had effectively eliminated wind-driven convective heat loss from the lower third of the shell, the zone most exposed in a standard structure. The limestone wall, charged by 6 to 8 hours of stove heat each day, continued radiating warmth at a measurable level for 10 to 12 hours after the fire dropped the coals. The sunken floor, sitting 18 inches below grade, benefited from ground-conducted warmth that held the floor surface between 48 degrees Fahrenheit and 54 degrees Fahrenheit, 9 degrees Celsius and 12 degrees Celsius, throughout the cold snap, functioning as a passive thermal floor that no above-grade cabin could replicate without added insulation. The curved roof, which everyone had feared would shed heat like a radiator in reverse, turned out to deflect wind load in a way that flat-roofed and steeply pitched structures couldn't match. There was no flat surface for the sustained northwest wind to press against and extract heat from. The airflow curved around the shell and moved on. The net result, 55 degrees Fahrenheit, 31 degrees Celsius warmer on the coldest recorded morning than the average interior temperature of the 3 nearest comparable dwellings. Less than half the firewood consumed, and a fire that, once banked for the night, didn't need to be restarted until mid-morning, because the stone wall was still working. Calvin Marsh went home, looked at his own north wall, and started thinking about limestone. The shift didn't happen with an announcement. There was no public moment where Rupert Gandy reversed his position or Dale Pruitt revised his written assessment. That's not how it works in small counties. What happened instead was quieter, slower, and more durable, the way all genuine changes in practice tend to spread when they're driven by utility rather than fashion. It started with questions. Calvin Marsh was the first, but not the last. By February, 3 men had come to Vernon's door asking about the berm depth, the stone wall dimensions, and what kind of pitch he'd use on the exterior steel. Vernon answered every question without ceremony. He showed them his temperature log. He let them feel the limestone wall on a morning when the stove had been cold for 8 hours. By the spring thaw, oral accounts from the Milk River Valley suggest that at least 4 property owners in the surrounding area had begun stockpiling flat stone from local coolies, not knowing exactly what they were going to do with it yet, but knowing they wanted it ready. 2 others had begun grading earth berms against the north and west walls of existing structures, adapting the principle without replicating the full system. The following winter, 1953 to 54, 3 new structures in the area incorporated some version of Vernon's earthen berm. None of them were Quonset huts. The technique transferred to conventional frame buildings without difficulty. A berm against a wood-framed wall with a vapor barrier performed nearly as well, reducing wind-driven heat loss through the lower wall section by a significant margin. The thermal mass wall concept was adapted by one man who couldn't source limestone and used a double-thick interior partition of river stone instead. It worked. By the winter of 1955 to 56, regional accounts suggest that close to a dozen structures within 40 miles of Vernon's property had incorporated at least one element of the system he'd assembled. The county extension office, without ever directly citing Vernon's work, updated its cold climate dwelling guidance to include language about earthen berming as a traditional and effective windbreak method for exterior walls in exposed locations. Rupert Gandy, the contractor who had predicted the structure would be uninhabitable by spring, was asked about it years later by a younger builder. According to a family account shared with the Historical Society, his answer was brief. The steel didn't rot. The man knew what he was doing. That was the totality of the reversal. But in Blaine County, it was enough. Vernon Holt had never tried to prove anything. He had tried to stay warm and use less with doing it. The community had watched him succeed, and then, quietly without drama, they had decided to do the same thing. Here is what Rupert Gandy saw when he looked at that Quonset hut in the fall of 1952, a metal building with dirt pushed against it. Here is what Vernon Holt saw, A curved structural shell with three distinct thermal problems: conductivity, wind exposure, and cold air infiltration at floor level, each of which had a known, tested solution that people on the North American plains have been using in various forms for generations. The earthen berm wasn't Vernon's invention. Sod house builders on the Kansas and Nebraska plains in the 1870s and 1880s had understood that packed earth against a wall was a better insulator than any wood framing available to them. The thermal mass wall was older still. Adobe construction in the American Southwest had used massive earthen and stone walls as passive heat storage for centuries, a technique that the region's indigenous builders had refined long before the first European settler arrived. The sunken floor appeared in the pit house designs of numerous plains and plateau cultures, as well as in the earth-sheltered dugouts that homesteaders across the High Line had used when timber was unavailable. Vernon hadn't read an engineering textbook. He had paid attention to what the land and its history had already demonstrated. What the experts possessed was experience with one system: the standard above-grade, square-framed, conventionally insulated cabin. That system worked. But it worked by brute force. By burning enough wood to compensate for the heat, it was constantly losing. It was, in engineering terms, a high-consumption structure. Vernon's system worked by reducing the losses in the first place, which meant the stove had less work to do, which meant the fire could burn lower and slower, which meant it would lasted longer and the interior temperature remained more stable through the night. This is a distinction that gets lost in every era's version of the argument between conventional wisdom and practical innovation. The experts weren't wrong about what they knew. They were wrong about what they didn't know, which is always the more dangerous blind spot. The physics here are not mysterious. Thermal mass, stone, earth, water, adobe, absorbs heat energy during warm periods and releases it during cold ones. The rate of release is slow and steady, which is exactly what a shelter needs through a long winter night. Earthen berming reduces convective heat loss by replacing fast-moving cold air against a wall surface with slow, stable ground mass. A sunken floor exploits the fact that the earth below frost depth maintains a temperature that, while not warm, is dramatically less cold than the ambient winter air above it. These are not frontier superstitions. They are measurable physical properties that engineers now encode in passive solar and earth-sheltered building standards. Vernon Holt assembled them in a surplus metal shell on a Montana homestead because it was what he had, and it was what made sense. He didn't ask whether it looked right. He asked whether it would work. It stayed 55 degrees Fahrenheit, 31 degrees Celsius warmer than his neighbors' cabins on the coldest morning of 1953. The firewood he didn't burn that winter cost him nothing and weighed nothing and took up no space in his wood pile. That was the answer. The people who mocked him weren't cruel. They were simply reading from a script that the land had already revised and hadn't told them yet. What part of Vernon's system would you apply to your own place today? The berm, the thermal mass wall, or the sunken floor? And where are you watching from? Tell us in the comments. We read every one. If this video gave you something worth thinking about, hit the like button and share it with someone who's serious about building or surviving in cold climates. Subscribe if you want this kind of knowledge delivered every week. Real techniques, real history, real engineering. We'll see you in the next one.